We're driving through a river right now in the Jeep. For thousands of years, humans have drawn lines on the Earth, dividing the planet into nations. But there's some parts of the world that no empire, nation, or state has been able to tame. Just the geography here is completely unruly. Land that is so high, so rugged, that states have found it impossible to exert control. We're about to hit 4,000 meters. Feeling the effects. These are called non-state spaces. Definitely feels like humans were never meant to be here. And the people who settle in these places sought refuge from borders. But even here, among the highest mountains in the world, this stateless lifestyle is coming to an end. Non-state spaces have always existed all over the globe. They're usually high up in mountains, far from the reach of any government. And the people who live here didn't come here by chance. Most of them are communities who fled into the mountains to evade expanding government forces. Some communities were escaping capture, like those in Africa fleeing from the Arab and Atlantic slave trades. Other groups retreated to remote regions to escape ruling powers who they opposed. From the Inuit in the Arctic to the Berbers in North Africa to the Himalaya in the Amazon rainforest. Examples exist all over the globe of people who chose rugged terrain over taxes, war, famine, and subjugation from state powers. Today, there are some 5,000 indigenous groups living in 90 countries, numbering in total around 370 million people worldwide. 70% of those are in Asia. Most of these groups have integrated into countries, but for those who reside deep in the mountains, geography has largely held off the influence of any kind of centralized government. So I came up here to visit one community that fled to the mountains 1,200 years ago. Back then, the Tibetan Empire, which was just north of here, was pursuing its own state-making project, its own empire, and it was growing. As the Tibetan Empire grew, its borders eventually encompassed the Bon religion. This was a religious group that predates Buddhism. The Bon fought to preserve its culture within the Tibetan Empire. They resisted the empire, but eventually failed. And instead of assimilate to this new empire, they fled, and they came here, to these mountains, where they created a life away from the militaries, the taxes, the religion, and the control of the Tibetan Empire. And that life continues today. Eventually, this whole area would be drawn into a modern state, the state of Nepal, and Tibet, where these people came from, would become China. But these people don't identify as Chinese or necessarily Nepali.
People here, they wanted the kids to learn Tibetan and as their language, because we are more related with the Tibetan culture.
The 25 families that live here have their own distinct identity. They speak their own dialect of Tibetan. They mainly live off the land, farming and raising animals to survive. The Himalayan mountain range is particularly rich with these examples of non-state spaces. So many examples, in fact, that a group of anthropologists argue that this place should actually be its own region. They use the term zomia to describe this long range of mountains where people have set up for thousands of years without the help of governments or states. The borders of this zomia concept encompass 100 million people. It runs through 8 countries, but is on the periphery of each. The diverse set of peoples living here have a varying degree of interaction with their country governments. I came to this region, one of the most remote zones within Zomia. But even here, you can feel that Zomia's stateless days are numbered. Everywhere you go up here, you see herds of animals, and shepherds guiding them through the mountains. After leaving this Bon village, I moved north and came across a different community, where this family's lifestyle is based almost entirely on the movement of their animals. We're at 4,200 meters. Tibet is just right over this hill, and I'm hanging out with some yak today. This family's actually nomadic. They're constantly moving around throughout the year. So they'll be in this pasture for a little bit while the yak will graze here and eat this grass, and then they'll move on to another place. Meanwhile, the grasses here will have time to regenerate. The dung from these yak right now will help fertilize the land, and they'll eventually come back here, maybe next year, and they will find a pasture full of really wonderful grass that's full of nutrients that their yak can graze again. And there's no external inputs to this. There's no fertilizer or irrigation infrastructure. And this whole process and technique hinges on their ability to be able to move freely throughout this region, which hasn't been a problem for hundreds of years as this place has been basically rid of any sort of borders or control. But that's changing very quickly.
This is where the Tibetan language is spoken. The many communities in these mountains have always considered themselves Tibetan, moving freely into Tibet for trade and religious practices. But in 1950, China controversially annexed Tibet. They eventually negotiated this borderline with Nepal. Notice that it goes right through what these people think of as Tibet. The yak grazers I met are mostly based down here on the Nepal side, and luckily for them, this border only existed in theory. The yak grazers continued to graze their animals deep into Tibet as they had for hundreds of years. But over the years, China started getting rich, which came with a renewed desire to project its influence and protect its borders, especially in Tibet, where people were fleeing to get away from Chinese rule. China now had the money, technology, and geopolitical motive to start taming this region. They started crushing protests from Tibetans and setting up military infrastructure on the Tibetan plateau. And in 1999, they built this fence on the border, marking the end of the unfettered mobility that these people had depended on for centuries in this non-state space. This place that had been too high for borders suddenly had to adapt to the first concept of boundaries and control coming from faraway governments.
Most of them has left that occupation because of the boundary and less space for grazing for the animals.
I wanted to go see this fence. At over 15,000 feet above sea level, it has to be one of the highest borders on Earth. So I'm on the windy Tibetan plateau looking at the border, but we're half a kilometer away and something really weird has happened. My driver, who's Nepali, stopped and said, "We can't go any further." And I was like, well, we're on Nepali sovereign territory. Why couldn't we just go up to the fence? I've been able to do this at every other country I've ever been to. He said, no, the Chinese will come over and they'll snatch us. Now, we're still very much on the Nepali side, but the Chinese come in here routinely to ask questions, to even detain people randomly. They have surveillance, they have watchtowers, even on the Nepali side. China now has the technology and political motive to exert control in this remote and rugged region, to militarize its border here. Oh, okay, we should go. This isn't the only effort by a faraway government to tame this region. The governments of Nepal, India, and China are also building the first roads here. It's a lofty goal. So we've got a landslide on the road, which means we can go no further in the Jeep, and we're gonna have to hike. The thinking here is that a road system could serve as a trade artery through the Himalaya mountains, eventually.
We're stuck again, this time on a waterfall with a 200-foot cliff by the side of it. And so yes, while these state forces are slowly encroaching on this terrain, it's gonna be long work, and it's not gonna be easy. They're slowly chipping away, but man, this place just was never meant to be tamed.
With the road, there is like people have changed their interest from old indigenous practices to the new ways of living.
Nepal is sandwiched between the two largest countries on Earth, divided by these massive Himalaya mountains. A road would create an enormous trade opportunity between these countries. So there's been a blitz of construction projects aimed at creating a viable road through this mountain pass. The Indian government is funding projects like this bridge. And locals told me that the Chinese government routinely sends building materials to help construction. The road still has a long way to go before it can sustain large flows of goods. But even now, the road is reshaping the relationship that these communities have with the outside world, shifting their economy from bartering to cash-based markets, where residents can create businesses around cheap goods from China. And as always with change, there are winners and losers. Everything here is made of yak. This tent, which is made entirely of yak wool, it's yak cheese, tea with yak butter in it. They're drinking yak milk, which is extremely delicious. These people who are used to bartering and are used to living off of the products of their animals are having a hard time integrating, having a hard time finding a space in this new economy that is based on cash and is based on big international flows of goods. That Bon community whose customs had been so well preserved in these mountains have also felt the effects of this road.
The worst will be definitely for the culture here. It's changing a lot.
People are leaving, children especially. Parents want to educate their kids and they're sending them to India or to Kathmandu to get educated. A lot of these kids will go their entire childhood without actually being in this community.
We found that when the kids came back, they didn't know anything about their culture or tradition in the village.
You have to remember, these people set up in the mountains specifically to preserve their tradition and culture. And so to see it disappear overnight due to these modernizing forces is giving people a lot of anxiety. The way they've solved this is that they're building this school that is based on educating children in the Bon tradition and the language of this community. But despite the disruptive effects of the road, most people I talk to are still happy it's here.
Access to different commodities and making our life easier with health facilities and education system.
For centuries, people have escaped modern civilization by fleeing to the mountains. But now, generations later, for some, these mountains can feel more like a trap than a refuge.